The storm rolled in slowly that morning, the kind that crept under doorways and found its way into bones. Snow fell in hushed flurries across the small town of Renshaw, Pennsylvania, coating the cracked sidewalks and bare tree limbs in an eerie stillness. It was a Tuesday just after the holiday break, and everything about the day felt suspended in time, muted, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Inside the modest walls of St. Margaret's Community Hospital, time moved at a steadier pace. The staff, accustomed to flu cases and fractured bones, barely noticed the growing shadows outside. Room 306, tucked at the end of the West Wing, was quiet except for the soft click of a second hand circling an analog wall clock. What happened in that room on January 7th would not only upend the lives of those inside it, it would challenge the very boundaries between life and death. Her name was Elizabeth Renner, 41 years old, a high school chemistry teacher, wife to Brian, mother of two, known around town for her punctuality, her red scarf in winter, her tendency to tap her thumb against her coffee cup when deep in thought. She was the kind of woman people felt they understood, reliable, grounded, present, and then, without warning, she died. It happened during third period. Students later described it as sudden. One moment she was reviewing molecular bonds, and the next, her words caught mid-sentence. Her eyes fluttered. Her body stiffened. Then collapsed. It wasn't dramatic. It was silent, almost graceful, like a leaf surrendering to wind. Panic rippled through the classroom. A student ran to get the nurse. Another tried to wake her, shaking her shoulder, whispering her name. But Elizabeth didn't respond. She didn't blink. She didn't move. Don't forget to subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next major crime stories. By the time the paramedics arrived, her pulse was gone. The ER at St. Margaret's was not equipped for mysteries. When Elizabeth was wheeled in, skin pale, limbs slack, protocol dictated swift clinical action. They administered epinephrine, defibrillated, compressed, monitored. For 29 minutes, they fought. Her body gave them nothing in return. Flatline. At 11:47 a.m., Dr. Nathan Wexler, a seasoned physician with 18 years of unshakable calm, removed his gloves and quietly declared time of death. The nurse charted it. The machines were shut down. A death certificate was printed and signed. They called her husband. Brian Renner arrived half an hour later. He didn't cry right away. He sat down in the chapel, elbows on knees, eyes locked to floor. Grief for him came slowly, like molasses breaking a dam. Elizabeth's body remained in room 306 under the sterile glow of overhead lights. She was cleaned, covered, left undisturbed until the transport team could move her to the hospital morgue. Outside, snow began to fall heavier. The temperature dropped 5 degrees in less than an hour. A tree branch cracked under the weight of ice. And inside the hospital, a strange current shifted the air. No one noticed when the lights above room 306 flickered. Nurse Dana Whitaker had drawn the short straw. A fresh graduate only months into her residency, she'd never handled a deceased patient alone. At 1:28 p.m., clipboard in hand, she approached room 306 with mechanical calm. She paused outside the door, inhaled slowly, and stepped in. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender, a calming spray some nurses use more for themselves than for the patients. Elizabeth lay beneath the white sheet, arms folded, jaw relaxed in death's final mercy. Dana moved toward the bed, pulling gloves on with trembling fingers. Then the room changed. She wouldn't be able to explain it later. Not to the charge nurse, not to the doctors, not even to herself. But she felt it, a shift like the air pressing inward. The silence grew too thick. The humming of the overhead light vanished. Something unseen seemed to lean closer, and the sheet moved. Not a dramatic jolt, just a whisper of motion. Dana froze, every nerve tightening. She stared, watched again. The sheet shifted once more, this time unmistakably, rising and falling in a shallow rhythm. Elizabeth was breathing. Dana's clipboard hit the floor with a sharp crack. Her scream followed a second later, sharp, primal, echoing down the hallway and bringing 2 nurses and a physician running. The room erupted into chaos. Machines reconnected, monitors restarted, vitals rechecked, and then, impossibly undeniably, a pulse, faint, irregular. But there, Dr. Wexler stood at the foot of the bed, eyes wide, lips parted as though caught mid-prayer. "This can't be," he whispered. She was gone. She was gone. Elizabeth's eyes fluttered open, slow, glassy, as if surfacing from miles beneath the sea. Her pupils dilated unevenly. Her lips moved, but no sound escaped. Her skin was colder than it should have been. Her gaze didn't seem to settle on anything in the room. Not the lights, not the doctor, not even her own hands. Wexler ordered her stabilized and rushed to ICU. Blood work, imaging, monitoring, explanations. But there were none. No anoxia, no irregular toxins, no cardiac rhythms to support survival. And yet, Elizabeth Renner was alive, at least biologically. News spread quickly through the hospital, though officially no statement was made. Unofficially, whispers filled the halls. The dead teacher. She came back. She wasn't really dead, right? But the staff who had been there, those who had touched her cooling skin, who had watched the monitors go blank, they knew she had been gone. And now she was back. For 2 days, Elizabeth said nothing. She lay in her bed, sometimes staring at the ceiling, sometimes watching shadows dance along the walls. She followed people with her eyes, but made no effort to speak. Her vitals remained just stable enough to puzzle the physicians. On the 3rd day, she whispered something. Dana was the only one in the room. She leaned close. Elizabeth's lips barely moved. He said, "I wasn't finished yet." "Who?" Dana asked, heart-thudding. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. Not of grief, but of something else. Something deeper. Primal. Her mouth opened again. "I saw them. All of them." Dana stepped back. Outside the room, the storm that calmed briefly returned with new fury. The wind howled down the halls like a cry in the dark. And in the shadows of that hospital, something had begun to follow Elizabeth Renner. They thought she had cheated death. But the truth was, death had only stepped aside, and it wouldn't wait forever. The second time Elizabeth opened her eyes, the air in the room seemed to hold its breath. It was the early hours of January 10th, 3 days after her official time of death, and nearly 60 hours after her inexplicable return to life. Room 314 in the ICU wing was dimly lit. Curtains drawn tight against the frost-laced windows, a heart monitor pulsing faintly in the background. The night nurse had stepped out for a coffee refill, leaving Elizabeth alone. Though even in her isolation, it didn't feel as though she was truly alone. Her eyes opened slowly, pupils dilated too wide for the low light, darting side to side as though registering the unfamiliar space. Her fingers flexed slightly beneath the hospital blanket, moving as if testing the gravity of a room. She inhaled sharply, not the choking gas of someone who had nearly drowned, but something else, like a person surfacing from a memory too dark to retell. Elizabeth did not cry. She did not ask where she was. She simply stared straight ahead at the ceiling, mouth parted, jaw slightly slack. The ceiling tile above her bore a brown water stain shaped vaguely, like a bird mid-flight. She watched it as if it might move. When the nurse returned, Elizabeth turned her head, her gaze locking on her with such intensity that the woman dropped the cup. It shattered on the tile. No one in the hospital would admit it openly, but many who entered that room, nurses, aides, even a janitor, described an atmosphere that clung to skin like humidity, a pressure in the chest that lingered long after leaving. People said Elizabeth's eyes didn't follow movement. They predicted it, that sometimes she mouthed words seconds before someone spoke them aloud. Others insisted they heard whispering near her bed when the room was empty. The whispers had no source, no beginning, just breath and syllables, fading before comprehension. The official explanation remained clinical: cardiac arrest, possible temporary brain death, spontaneous circulation return, Lazarus syndrome, rare but documented. But behind closed doors, Wexler's team was not convinced. There were too many inconsistencies. No brain damage. No detectable cause of cardiac arrest. And then there was the blood work. Normal ranges on every level, except for one irregularity in her white blood cell count that none of the specialists could explain. A mutation. An anomaly. An echo of something unknown. The first death had been merciful. Quick. Quiet. But the days that followed began to unravel everything Elizabeth Renner had ever been. Her husband, Brian, had been allowed to visit once she was stabilized. He entered the room with the cautious steps of a man afraid of waking a dream. He didn't speak at first, just stood by her bedside, gripping the metal railing as if it anchored him to reality. She looked at him, blinking slowly, as if trying to recognize a face seen in another life. "I thought I lost you," he whispered. She smiled. The corners of her mouth twitched up, but it wasn't joy. It was recognition, like a stranger remembering a name they'd only heard once. She reached out and placed her fingers lightly over his. "I wasn't gone," she said softly. Not completely. There was silence between them, but something else was there. Brian's hand tightened. "What do you mean?" Elizabeth's eyes shimmered with something unspeakable. "I saw things, places. I wasn't dreaming. I was awake, aware, but not here. It was like walking through echoes." He tried to press her, but she drifted off mid-sentence, her heart rate spiking suddenly. Alarms blared. Nurses rushed in. The moment passed. Later, Brian would describe that interaction as the last time he saw his wife as Elizabeth. After that, he said, she came back, but not everything came back with her, and not everything stayed behind. On the fourth night, the hallucinations began. It started with figure, shadow-like, hunched, seen standing in the corner of the room by two separate nurses on two different nights. No one could identify him. The security footage revealed only static during those hours. Elizabeth began murmuring in her sleep, words in a language no one could recognize. Guttural, rhythmic. When played back from a bedside recording device, the audio spiked at frequencies normally inaudible to the human ear. Dr. Wexler, desperate for answers, requested a psychiatric evaluation. The psychiatrist, Dr. Lena Horvath, met with Elizabeth on January 12th. What was supposed to be a 1-hour session lasted only 12 minutes. Horvath exited the room pale, trembling, and requested a transfer of case. When asked why, she simply said, "She looked at me, and I felt like I was falling inside her." A few hours later, she left the hospital grounds without signing out and wouldn't return for over a week. That same night, Elizabeth spoke again, this time to a nurse named Miguel who was adjusting her four-line. Her eyes flicked open as he leaned over her, and she said, in a low whisper, "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe anymore." Miguel froze. "What do you mean?" "They're coming. They're already inside." The hospital staff began requesting reassignment from room 314. Patient records were triple-checked. Monitors were replaced. But the strange incidents only escalated. Lights dimmed inexplicably. Medical equipment malfunctioned in her room and nowhere else. The hospital chapel reported flickering candles, despite the fact that all flames had been replaced with battery-operated lights years ago. One nurse, assigned to a night shift near Elizabeth's room, claimed she woke up in her car 2 hours later with no memory of leaving the building. Rumors turned into urban legends. Some believed Elizabeth had been possessed. Others said she had crossed into a place no one was meant to return from. And a small but growing number of staff believed something had followed her back. Dr. Wexler tried to intervene. He brought in a neurologist from Pittsburgh. A priest from the local diocese came without invitation, citing a call he had felt in a dream. A bioethicist wrote an anonymous letter warning that Elizabeth Renner's body should not be studied or touched any further. Still, none of them could explain what happened on the evening of January 13th, when Elizabeth sat bolt upright in her bed, unhooked her own four, and walked barefoot down the hallway. Security footage showed her moving with unnatural precision. No hesitation, no blinking, a soft smile fixed on her face. She entered the pediatric wing, stopping outside room 212, where a child named Evelyn Marsh was being treated for leukemia. Elizabeth stood there, unmoving, for 5 minutes. Then, just as suddenly, turned around and walked back. Evelyn woke up the next morning, in complete remission. Doctors were stunned. Her chart, previously filled with downward trending vitals, now showed full cellular recovery. No plausible explanation. Elizabeth had not spoken a word since. But what unnerved Wexler most came later that night, when he reviewed the security footage frame by frame. In 3 stills, barely half a second apart, Elizabeth's reflection in the glass wall of the NICU didn't match her movement. In the reflection, she was still looking in, but in real time, she had already turned away. By the end of the week, staff turnover near her room tripled. Patients on the same floor reported nightmares, each eerily similar. A pale woman, a dark corridor, a voice that said, "You weren't supposed to come back." And still, Elizabeth never cried, never questioned, never wept for the days she lost, or the mystery she became. Instead, she waited, as though she knew something was coming. What no one realized then was that her first death hadn't been an accident, and her second wouldn't be one either. There's a moment in every investigation, medical, criminal, or otherwise, when logic begins to fray, when data ceases to clarify and instead deepens the mystery. For Dr. Adrian Wexler and his team, that moment arrived on the morning of January 15th. For days after Elizabeth Renner had risen from death and 2 days before she would return to it, Wexler stood over a spread of lab results in his office, sunlight slicing through the blinds in pale gray streaks. The data should have provided answers. It didn't. Instead, it presented a portrait of a body that was not merely healed. It was rewritten. Her blood, once typical, now bore cell structures with minor but persistent anomalies. T cells had divided too quickly, white cells that resisted decay, platelets with regenerative patterns more commonly seen in experimental gene therapy, except Elizabeth had never been a part of any trial. No autoimmune conditions, no viral triggers, no prior mutations. And then there was the MRI. Her hippocampus, once showing mild signs of stress-related damage from a prior car accident, was now pristine. Neural activity in her occipital lobe pulsed higher than any baseline Wexler had ever seen. Not erratic, just more enhanced, as though her brain were operating on an internal frequency no machine could yet categorize. Have we ruled out imaging error? Wexler asked the radiology technician. The young woman nodded, triple-checked. I even ran her scans through 3 different models. It's not an error, Dr. Wexler. Whatever this is, it's real. He stared at the scans long after she left, his fingers pressing into the bridge of his nose. Part of him wanted to believe it was just a miracle, a 1 in a billion biological fluke. But Elizabeth's eyes said otherwise. Whenever he entered her room now, she didn't just watch him. She studied him, like someone tracing the outline of a secret written in invisible ink. Wexler assembled a task force, quietly. No press, no public case file. He didn't want Elizabeth to become a media spectacle. Not yet. He brought in experts from virology, neurology, genetics, and, against his better judgment, a parapsychologist from Yale who had published a controversial paper on consciousness persistence beyond clinical death. They called themselves the Corridor Group, a name lifted from something Elizabeth had murmured in her sleep. There's a corridor, endless, but I wasn't alone in it. Dr. Lila Kazan, the parapsychologist, was the first to suggest a non-biological component. She showed the group brainwave overlays captured during Elizabeth's REM cycles. These patterns shouldn't exist, she explained, her finger circling a complex waveform. The sequence here? It matches no known sleep stage. It's deliberate, repetitive. It's like code. Code? Asked Wexler, skeptical. Neural code, she clarified. Conscious processing. Language while unconscious. The geneticist, Dr. Bram Altieri, leaned in. It's like something is using her brain as a transmission device. Or she's using it, said Kazan, but from somewhere else. That silenced the room. Their investigation took them deeper into Elizabeth's life before her first death, and with each layer they peeled back, the mystery only deepened. Elizabeth had no history of mental illness, substance use, or trauma beyond a minor head injury in a fender bender 2 years prior. She was a kindergarten teacher, beloved by her students. Quiet, thoughtful, no enemies, no secrets, or so it seemed. But when Wexler tracked down her former neurologist in the car accident, he uncovered something that had never made it into her permanent file. She had a brief dissociative episode in the ER, the doctor explained. She kept repeating a phrase, "I see the watchers. They're behind the glass." It lasted maybe 20 minutes. We chalked it up to shock. Elizabeth never mentioned it again. But 3 months later, her journals, found by Brian in a box beneath their bed, began to take a dark turn. The first few pages were normal, grocery lists, lesson plans, reflections. But then came drawings, fractured corridors, endless doors, faceless figures hovering in the margins. One page simply read, "The veil is thinner than they tell us." She was unraveling long before her heart stopped. Before we proceed, kindly like this video and hit the subscribe button for more Enigma stories like this. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, incidents continued to escalate. Security guards began reporting lost time near her room. One man claimed he walked into the hallway at 2:04 a.m. and blinked, only to find himself outside the hospital entrance at 2:39, with frost on his eyelashes and no memory of how he got there. Surveillance footage was missing for those 35 minutes. The feed cut to static. Another nurse, Angela Marsh, suffered a breakdown after hearing Elizabeth say her name before she introduced herself, and then calmly recite the names of her 2 deceased siblings, facts never publicly recorded. Angela left mid-shift and never returned. When Wexler attempted to move Elizabeth to a secure psychiatric unit, she refused to walk. Instead, she turned to him and said, "You're asking the wrong questions. It's not what happened to me. It's what I brought back." The real break in the medical puzzle came when Dr. Altieri sequenced Elizabeth's mitochondrial DNA and compared it to a baseline from before her death. There had been a significant shift, a single nucleotide polymorphism, but in a region of the genome never before linked to any known disease or condition. "What does it mean?" Wexler asked. Altieri hesitated. "It means she's not a perfect copy of who she was. She's changed." Wexler pressed. "No, it's more than that," Altieri said. "She's evolved." That word hit harder than anyone expected. Evolved. But into what? Elizabeth was no longer merely a patient. She was becoming something else. A locus of change. A mirror to something beyond human understanding. Her blood defied entropy. Her mind connected to something larger, invisible, but undeniably present. Kazan called it a cognitive incursion. Altieri called it quantum biological feedback. Wexler simply called it impossible. But the evidence was clear. Elizabeth had returned from death, but not alone, and whatever was waking inside her was still unfolding. By January 17th, Elizabeth stopped speaking entirely. She communicated through drawings now, frantic, intricate sketches of spirals, doorways, and fractured silhouettes. One sketch depicted her own hospital bed surrounded by figures in glass helmets, staring down with hollow eyes. In another, she drew a corridor of light with no floor beneath it, just an endless fall. She signed it with a symbol, not a name. It resembled a double helix, but with one side broken and rewritten. Dr. Wexler made one last note in his journal before locking it in a desk drawer. She was meant to die. Something brought her back, but not for healing, for harvest. And the very next day, Elizabeth Renner died again, but not in the way anyone expected, and certainly not in peace. The snow had begun to fall again on the morning Elizabeth Renner died for the second time. Fat, wet flakes that clung to the glass panes of St. Elias Medical Center like nature itself was holding its breath. Room 409 was quiet, save for the low hum of machines and the occasional whisper of footsteps outside her door. But inside, something had shifted. Dr. Adrian Wexler noticed it immediately. He had arrived just after 6 a.m., expecting to see Elizabeth awake, sketching as she had every morning for the past week. But her bed was empty. The sheets were folded with meticulous precision. The four-stand unhooked, the heart monitor powered down. A single drawing remained on her pillow, ink still wet. It was a self-portrait, but not as she was. The figure wore her features, but was cloaked in darkness, mouth stitched shut, hands outstretched as if pressing against a wall of invisible glass. In place of eyes, 2 burning circles, red like fresh blood, and behind her stood 7 shapes, tall, thin, featureless. Watchers. Wexler's breath caught. He turned to the nurse's station in a panic. Where is she? Who moved her? No one had. The night nurse, Marla, was pale and trembling. She was in bed at 3 o'clock when I checked her vitals. And then she wasn't. We didn't hear anything. No alarms, no footsteps. It's like she vanished. Security swept the hospital. Hallways, elevators, stairwells, even the roof. Nothing. Surveillance footage between 3:02 and 3:46 a.m. was corrupted, twisted into jagged static. In its place were 6 seconds of clear footage. Elizabeth standing in the corridor outside her room, eyes closed, head tilted back, and hovering 2 inches above the floor. When the clock hit 3:46, every monitor on the 4th floor surged and went dead. And just like that, she was gone. Her body was discovered 3 hours later in the sub-basement. A utility worker had stumbled upon it in an old maintenance corridor sealed off since 1998 due to asbestos exposure. No one should have had access. Yet there she was, lying in the center of the narrow hallway, limbs splayed like a marionette abandoned mid-dance. Face turned upward, eyes wide open and impossibly dilated. No sign of trauma. No trace of struggle. But the temperature in that corridor was 36 degrees Fahrenheit, well below ambient, and her skin showed no signs of exposure to cold. Her core temperature was still normal. Wexler was called down immediately. He stood over her body for a long time, saying nothing. Then he whispered, "She brought something back, and now it's done with her." The autopsy began within hours, conducted under strict isolation protocols. Dr. Lena Marquez, the attending pathologist, had reviewed hundreds of cases in her career. Nothing prepared her for Elizabeth Renner. There were no marks, no embolism, no organ failure. Every system functioned in textbook condition. Even the brain, while no longer active, was structurally flawless. But there was one anomaly in her bone marrow, a cluster of cells never before documented in any human specimen. Multinucleated, hypergenerative, and bioluminescent under UV light. They were concentrated in her sternum, as if something had seated itself there. Dr. Marquez sent the samples to 3 independent labs under aliases. 2 of them returned void, the samples mysteriously missing upon arrival. The 3rd lab, a private biotech research firm in Copenhagen, returned a brief statement. "Do not contact us again. Destroy all related materials." Whatever this is, it's not human. The case was sealed the following day by federal agents who refused to identify their agency. They arrived in unmarked vehicles, dressed in civilian clothes, but armed with credentials Wexler had never seen before. They took Elizabeth's body, all records, the corrupted surveillance drives, and every drawing she had made. The hospital was placed under a temporary gag order. Staff were warned violations would carry legal and financial penalties. Even Wexler was forced to sign an NDA under threat of losing his license. Elizabeth Renner disappeared a second time. Only this time she would not return. But some things could not be buried. 6 days later, Nurse Marlowe was found dead in her apartment. Bathtub overflowing, eyes bloodshot, her fingernails torn as if she'd been scratching at the inside of her own skull. Her bathroom mirror bore a phrase written in condensation. The corridor has no end. A month after that, Dr. Bram Altery vanished while attending a genetics conference in Montreal. His hotel room was found ransacked. On the mirror, the same phrase. And Dr. Kazan? She left her position at Yale, moved off-grid to a cabin in northern Maine. When Wexler tried to reach her, he received a single email reply. They're still watching. The veil is thin. By spring, Wexler himself was unraveling. He had begun to see things. Hallways where none existed, doors ajar with no room behind them. Once, in his sleep, he awoke to find his journal lying open on the floor, pages fluttering, a message scrawled in handwriting not his own. You open the corridor. You can't close it now. He was no longer sure what part of Elizabeth had died, or what part had remained, but her legacy would not fade. Months later, a whistleblower leaked a heavily redacted report to an independent journalist. The document contained fragments from Elizabeth's autopsy, surveillance logs, and internal communications between unknown agencies, referring to the Renner incident as a Class A threshold event. It was published on a Fringe paranormal site and dismissed as fiction by most. Yet in the corners of the internet, forums began to emerge. People who had seen the corridor, who had died and returned, but not unchanged. They called themselves the Veiled. And in every post, the same image surfaced again and again, a corridor of infinite white, and a woman at the center, reaching out through the glass. Her name was whispered like a prayer or a warning, Elizabeth Renner. And now, years later, in the deepest vaults of undisclosed labs, scientists continue to study what she left behind, not just her cells, but the effect she had on others. A small cluster of hospital staff from St. Elias reported dreams months after the incident. Visions of doorways opening, of voices echoing through glass corridors, of being watched by something just beyond comprehension. The case of Elizabeth Renner would become one of the most aggressively buried events in modern medical history. But the true legacy wasn't her death. It was the door she opened, and what might someday walk through it. The sky above the Vermont Institute of Integrative Neurology was a flat, colorless gray, one of those mornings that felt like the world was holding its breath. Inside, a small team gathered in the basement-level conference room, the walls lined with lead sheeting and no windows in sight. A single photograph was taped to the center of the whiteboard, Elizabeth Renner's face, captured in a moment of eerie calm from the hospital surveillance footage, her expression unreadable, as if she'd already glimpsed something no one else could comprehend. It had been 3 years since her second and final death, and still she haunted them. Dr. Adrian Wexler sat at the head of the table, haggard and aged beyond his years. His once crisp hair was now threaded with streaks of silver, and the tremor in his right hand had grown worse. Across from him sat Dr. Lena Marquez, looking no better, her eyes darting toward every corner of the room, as if expecting something unseen to emerge. There were others now, too. Experts brought in quietly under the radar, xenobiologists, theoretical physicists, sleep researchers, even a linguist who specialized in dead languages. All of them had been selected for one reason. They had encountered something strange. All of them had passed the same vetting criteria. Claims dismissed as hallucinations by peers, yet uncannily similar in detail to the Elizabeth Renner case. And they all had dreams. The data was chaotic, riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions. But when overlaid, superimposed across different domains and disciplines, a faint shape began to emerge. What Elizabeth had experienced, what she had become, seemed to exist at the intersection of biology, consciousness, and something else, something unquantifiable, not spiritual, not religious, but dimensional. A fringe concept known among black budget circles as a veil layer hypothesis, a theorized space between life and death, thought and unthought, real and unreal. Wexler referred to it simply as a corridor, and Elizabeth hadn't just stepped into it. She had anchored it. The marrow cells retrieved from her autopsy, those inexplicable luminescent anomalies, had not been fully destroyed. Unknown to the government agencies that seized her remains, a second vial had been hidden by Marquez under a false sample name and smuggled to Wexler months later. For nearly 2 years, he and a clandestine biotech outfit in Switzerland ran tests. The cells had a half-life of nearly 0. But when exposed to specific frequencies of deep infrasound, 19 hertz, the so-called fear frequency, they showed signs of limited metabolic activity. And once, only once, they pulsed, not divided, not grew, pulsed, like a heartbeat, like a signal. It wasn't long before others came looking. In the spring of 2024, Wexler's research was abruptly shuttered by a European Oversight Committee. No official reason was provided. The lab was emptied overnight, the files scrubbed. But a week later, Wexler received a parcel with no return address. Inside was a small black flash drive containing hours of audio files, recordings from EEG sleep studies conducted at unrelated clinics worldwide. The files had one thing in common. During deep REM cycles, subjects had begun to speak in their sleep, whispering languages that bore no known roots, sketching corridor-like imagery in their journals, referring, again and again, to her, the woman with no time. Sometimes they said she was coming. Other times, that she was already here. They all had no prior knowledge of Elizabeth Renner. Marquez began mapping the events. Deaths, sightings, shared dreams, and patterns emerged. Concentric rings of influence around the site of her original awakening. First within the hospital, then the city, then the outliers. Strangers drawn into her gravitational pull without ever knowing her name. They found one man in rural Iowa who had drawn the exact same self-portrait Elizabeth had left on her hospital bed, identical down to the burning eyes and the watchers. He'd never seen her, had no internet. He claimed she visited him in sleep, that she was trapped in glass, that she was waiting for someone to break it, waiting for them. But the question remained, why her? Why Elizabeth Renner? Her medical history had been clean. Her neurological scans prior to the incident were ordinary. There was no record of dissociative symptoms, no prior hallucinations, no anomalous genetic markers. She was, by all accounts, an average woman, a graphic novelist, introverted, clever, quiet. But maybe that was it. She'd spent her life drawing other realities. Maybe she was simply more receptive. Maybe the corridor had always been there, and she just knew how to listen. Now, in 2025, a new initiative has begun. The team, operating under the codename Project Penumbra, is developing a cognitive interface designed to induce controlled exposure to corridor-like states through sensory deprivation, sound frequencies, and electrical stimulation. The goal, to create dialogue, to ask what Elizabeth could not, and perhaps to find a way back, if not to her, then to whatever she connected with. But Wexler knows the danger. Every attempt opens the door a little wider, and he has seen what happens when the corridor looks back. So far, 3 test subjects have failed to return to baseline cognition. One now speaks only in reverse. One draws doors obsessively. The third vanished from a locked room during an interface trial, leaving only a single sketch on the wall. Elizabeth, eyes open, mouth stitched shut, standing behind what looked like a pane of glass, with cracks spidering outward from her fists. And still, she calls, in static, in dreams, in whispers behind soundproof walls. Her case remains unsolved, not by incompetence, but by impossibility, a mystery that stretches the limits of medicine, physics, and human perception. But those who have dared to ask the question know one thing. Elizabeth Renner didn't die. Not completely. She changed, and she left the door open behind her. If you made it to the end of this chilling story, I want to hear from you. What do you think happened to Elizabeth? Is there a rational explanation, or have we crossed into something beyond understanding? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like if this case gave you chills. Subscribe for more haunting deep dives into unsolved crimes and inexplicable phenomena, right here on Major Crime Chronicles. There's always another door to open, and some should probably stay closed. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious,